A war veteran walks into a diner only to be humiliated by a group of bikers. They thought he was alone. They were wrong. Because Jason Statham was sitting there, and what he did next will restore your faith in quiet courage. Watch until the end. The road cut through the desert like a forgotten scar. It was late afternoon somewhere in the American heartland, one of those places where time moves slowly and the faces never change. The sky, painted in shades of orange, stretched behind rusted silos and gas pumps that whistled softly in the dry wind. Next to the highway, an old gas station clung to survival, embraced by a modest diner where weary travelers sought refuge, coffee, and a bit of quiet. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was simple yet welcoming. Worn-out red leather booths, walls lined with vintage signs, and a silent jukebox in the corner, as if it already knew music was no longer heard there. The air smelled of old fries and greasy oil. Truckers with raspy voices chewed slowly, and waitresses shuffled between tables with the patience of those who had seen it all. And then he walked in. The sound of the door opening was barely noticeable, but what drew attention was the slowness of the steps crossing the entrance. An elderly man, hunched over and plainly dressed, stepped over the threshold supported by a wooden cane. The faded military jacket he wore, bleached by time and sun, carried stories no one dared to ask. His face, deeply wrinkled, seemed burdened more by memories than by age. And yet, no one noticed him. Or rather, they pretended not to. He walked slowly, with difficulty. Every step required calculation and strength, as if the floor might give way at any moment. His eyes searched for a seat, avoiding contact. He didn't want to bother anyone, didn't want to impose. His only request was for a brief space to rest, perhaps sip a coffee and continue his journey. In the far corner of the diner, sitting alone by the window, Jason Statham watched silently. He wore a dark jacket and simple jeans. Nothing about him drew attention, except the eyes. His gaze scanned the room naturally, instinctively, like someone trained to detect tension before it erupted. He had noticed the elderly man the moment he walked in, but he wasn't the only one. At the other end of the room, a group of bikers occupied two tables. Loud laughter, mocking voices, dirty boots and leather jackets with skull emblems. Young, noisy, and far too confident for such a quiet place. Between sips of beer and bites of burgers, they sneered about useless old men and laughed with disdain. They weren't quiet. They wanted to be heard. They wanted to provoke. The elderly man, hands trembling slightly, picked up a glass of water at the counter and tried to make his way to an empty chair. But one of the bikers had purposefully stretched out a boot in his path, causing him to trip. The glass fell and shattered on the floor. The spilled water reflected the ceiling lights like tiny shards of shame. An uncomfortable silence took over the diner. The waitress froze with her notepad midair. A trucker pretended to read the menu. Everyone saw. No one reacted. Jason didn't move. The old man, embarrassed, bent down slowly to pick up the shards with trembling hands. The biker leader mimicked his movements with exaggerated sarcasm, laughing loudly and urging the others on. Cruel comments echoed like whiplashes. "Watch your back, Grandpa," one sneered. "Time to retire," said another. The humiliation was public, cruel, and deliberate. Jason remained seated, but his shoulders shifted slightly. A subtle adjustment in posture. His fingers touched the coffee mug, but he didn't drink. He didn't blink. The old man managed to stand, still shaking. He walked toward the door but was blocked once again. The gang leader stepped in front of him, using his body as a wall, laughing as if watching a comedy. He looked the veteran up and down and spat on the floor, near the old man's boot, full of disgust and contempt. The tension thickened. Everyone knew something terrible was unfolding, but no one had the courage to step in. Cell phones appeared discreetly. Shameful glances were exchanged. Complicit silence hung over the room like a heavy curtain. And then, for the first time, Jason moved. Slowly. He set the mug on the table, stood with absolute calm, and adjusted his jacket as if preparing for a casual stroll. His eyes met the gang leaders for a second. There was no anger, no rage, only resolve. The familiar features of his face now carried a shadow of judgment, silent and unshakable. Jason's footsteps echoed lightly on the floor, cutting through the silence like blades. The diner seemed to exhale. The gang leader was still smiling, but the corners of his grin now twitched. The others began to sense something off. That presence was not ordinary. The veteran remained still, unsure whether to thank or apologize. He was used to defending himself even when his body no longer allowed it. But now someone stood in front of him, someone who didn't turn away, someone who didn't pretend not to see. Jason stopped a few steps from the bikers. The room froze, and in that moment, before the first word was even imagined, before any action, the world seemed to hold its breath. The gang leader made a comment, laughing nervously, as if still in control. But Jason didn't respond. He simply stepped forward. One step that silenced the entire diner. No one there knew it yet. But what was about to happen would mark that place forever. Time seemed to have stopped. Inside the diner, the usual sounds had vanished. No frying sizzles from the griddle, no clinking forks scraping plates. Even the whispers between tables had faded, as if the entire space had been suspended by something invisible, yet overwhelming. Jason Statham had taken just one step, and that was enough. The gang leader still wore a crooked grin, but something in his eyes betrayed hesitation. He turned slightly, seeking visual reinforcement from his crew, as if looking for confirmation of dominance. But no matter how hard they tried to keep their relaxed stance, something in the air made it clear. The game had changed. Jason didn't speak. His eyes did the talking. And what they said was impossible to ignore. The old man, still near the door, watched the scene with eyes filled with fear and confusion. For the first time since he entered that place, he didn't look smaller than the others. There was someone standing in front of him, someone who had become a shield. The veteran, even with trembling hands and a hunched back, tried to lift his head. It was an almost imperceptible gesture, but it revealed something that time and abandonment had never fully erased. Dignity. Jason stood firm, feet planted like roots. His body seemed still, but everything about him was vigilant. His eyes scanned the slightest movements. His shoulders adjusted with pinpoint precision. He didn't show tension, only readiness. The bikers tried laughing again, louder this time, an attempt to shatter the silence. One of them mumbled something about a savior of old men, drawing muffled chuckles. But none of it lasted longer than a few seconds, because Jason didn't respond with words. He didn't blink. He didn't back down. His silence was more threatening than any insult. Around them, customers began to realize who they were dealing with. Whispers resurfaced, but this time, with a different tone. A woman leaned in toward her husband, wide-eyed. Is that him? Is that Jason? Other heads began to turn. Some customers discreetly pulled out their phones, leaning over tables to record the moment. There hadn't been any physical confrontation yet, but everyone could feel it was only a matter of time. The gang leader, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, took a step forward. His face hardened in an attempt to reassert control. He spoke loudly, gesturing, feigning indifference. But even he didn't believe in his performance. His body gave him away. Clenched hands, a stiff neck, eyes avoiding direct contact for more than 2 seconds. Jason didn't reply. He didn't need to. He took another step. Now they stood face to face. The veteran remained in the background, nearly holding his breath. The bikers moved together, trying to encircle Jason. But each of them felt something strange. Their feet seemed heavier, their reflexes slower. It was as if the mere presence of that man had drained their confidence, as if one wrong move could unleash something they couldn't control. Then it happened. A waitress, frozen beside the counter, accidentally dropped a porcelain plate. The crash shattered the silence with brutal clarity, drawing gasps from those nearby. But Jason didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked on the gang leader. Outside, the sun had already begun to set. Light streamed through the windows in golden streaks, illuminating parts of Jason's face. The scene looked like something out of a film. the silent hero standing alone against a crowd of arrogant men, defending someone who could no longer defend himself. But this wasn't a movie, and what was about to unfold, no one would ever forget. In the heavy silence, a memory began to form in the veteran's mind. The smell of burnt oil in the diner mixed with old echoes of smoke, sand, and blood. He saw himself again in war-torn fields, marching through wreckage and screams. That present moment, where a stranger stood in front of him like a shield, reminded him of comrades he had lost, men who knew the true meaning of loyalty and sacrifice. It was as if that single gesture, when standing tall against injustice, had the power to repair something inside him. A silent healing, a scar being stitched back together without words. Jason remained motionless, and yet imposed more movement on that room than anyone else present. The biker's smiles had vanished. The leader now nervously licked his lips. The tension was unbearable. He needed to act, needed to say something, needed to regain control before the stare of that man broke him down completely in front of his own crew. And he tried. He raised his chin and took a step forward, puffing his chest, but the gesture felt forced. His words came out sharp but shaky. He tried to provoke, tried to sound menacing. Jason, still silent, tilted his neck slightly, a gesture barely noticeable yet full of challenge. That's when everything changed. A trucker stood up from his seat and stepped back twice, just to get out of the way. Others began to subtly move away. The space around Jason widened as if by instinct. Everyone seemed to understand what was about to happen, and they wanted to witness it, but from a safe distance. Outside, a dog barked in the distance. A car sped down the road with a roar. The light from sunset cast long shadows across the diner's floor. The veteran took a deep breath, and then, finally, Jason raised his hand. A simple gesture, but it struck like thunder. The diner froze. Phones trembled in the hands of those filming. The gang leader swallowed hard, and one of the younger bikers took a step back, nearly tripping over his own chair. Jason didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need threats. His gesture said it all. The line had been crossed, and now the consequence was coming. The gang leader clenched his fists tightly and growled something inaudible. Jason took a slow step forward, and in that instant, everyone understood. He wasn't there to teach a lesson. He was there to end the humiliation, with or without permission. The gang leader clenched his teeth. His jaw trembled, but it was hard to tell whether it was anger or fear. He tried to convince himself he was still in control, that the man standing in front of him was just another meddler. But instinct told him otherwise. Something about Jason Statham made him hesitate. Something invisible but overwhelming. Jason remained motionless. His blank expression concealed precise calculation, eyes alert to every micro-movement, breath regulated, muscles ready. There was no apparent tension, but everything in him was prepared to explode, not from fury, but from necessity. He knew this moment well, the exact second before chaos. The gang leader let out a loud snort, like a beast refusing to lose dominance before its own pack. With a rough gesture, he shoved a chair aside and lunged forward. He was fast, but Jason was faster. With a simple twist of his torso, he dodged the first straight punch, and the biker's fist hit nothing but air. The poorly aimed force made the attacker lose balance and stumble, tripped by his own arrogance. Jason didn't strike back. He didn't need to. He simply let the man's own momentum take him down. The second biker came from the side, trying to catch him off guard, but Jason spun with lethal grace, grabbed the attacker's arm, and used it as leverage, redirecting his weight with mathematical precision. The impact was sharp, but not violent. A thud against the floor, the beginning of a public humiliation. The audience watched without blinking. No one moved. Phones were raised, recording everything. Some held their breath. It felt like they were witnessing more than a fight. This felt like justice. Two more bikers charged together, counting on their numerical advantage. One tried to grab Jason from behind. The other lunged with an uncoordinated kick. But Jason knew the choreography of savagery. A single sidestep was enough to dodge the kick. With an elbow, he struck the other's arm, neutralizing the attack from behind and forcing him back in pain. None of Jason's moves were exaggerated. Each one was clean, direct, calculated. He wasn't there to hurt. He was there to protect. And every gesture reinforced that. A dance of defense turned into a silent spectacle of total dominance. The gang leader got up again, furious, his cheeks red, eyes wide. This wasn't arrogance anymore. It was humiliation. And he couldn't bear being ridiculed in front of his own crew. With a muffled growl, he charged again, this time with everything he had. A wild punch followed by a high kick. No technique, just desperation. Jason ducked, dodging both attacks, and spun on his heel. A sharp sweep with his leg and the gang leader's knee gave out. He dropped to his knees, gasping, groaning, his pride more bruised than any bone. At the back, the veteran watched with tearful eyes. It wasn't just relief. It was recognition. He knew what it was to stand before someone who carried battles on their back and acted without needing applause. He knew what it meant to fight for someone the world had chosen to forget. And now, for the first time in a long time, he felt his pain had been seen. Jason was still surrounded. But the bikers' posture had changed. They no longer moved with certainty. Their steps were hesitant, their eyes confused. They were beginning to understand what they were up against. Not a movie hero, but a real man. Shaped by experience, hardened by silence, and driven by something they couldn't comprehend. Respect. The crowd around them didn't cheer. No one clapped. Silence reigned, like in a ceremony. This wasn't entertainment. It was justice being written in real time. Uncut, unfiltered, unchoreographed. Jason stood tall, hands relaxed, yet ready. One of the bikers tried to flee toward the exit. Another dropped his helmet on the floor, raising his hands in a gesture of moral surrender. The last one hesitated. His eyes scanned the fallen friends, the crowd's judging stares, the veteran still standing near the door. And then he looked at Jason, and he knew. He made one final charge, perhaps from pride, perhaps from despair. He ran in a straight line, yelling something no one understood. Jason spun to the side, caught the man's momentum, and with one smooth, fluid motion, swept the attacker's legs from beneath him. The impact was loud, a sharp thud against the floor, final. Jason stood, alone, in the center of the diner. Around him, the world was silent. None of the bikers tried to get up. Some murmured apologies. Others stared at the ground in shame. The leader remained on his knees, hands on the floor, head bowed low. Jason said nothing. His eyes moved across each face, not with anger, not with sarcasm. Just a firm look that carried the question no one dared to answer. Is this who you are? The veteran standing near the door took a step forward. His legs still trembled, but his posture held something that hadn't been there before: firmness. His shoulders lifted. His gaze rose. Dignity restored. Jason then walked toward him, slowly, without haste, as if time had started moving again. On the way, he stopped beside the gang leader, who still couldn't bring himself to look up. Shame crushed him more than any blow. Jason watched him for a few seconds, and then walked on. Without a word. The crowd parted. People moved like silent waves. No one touched him. No one spoke. But everyone knew they were witnessing something they'd never forget. Jason and the veteran crossed the diner's doorway together. Outside, the sky was stained red, as if the day had bled to purge the injustice it had witnessed. The highway whispered in the distance. Crickets in the arriving night filled the air. Jason paused beside the parked car. He helped the veteran into the seat with care, closed the door gently, then looked toward the horizon. Inside the diner, the gang leader slowly pushed himself up with help from his friends. Hatred burned in his eyes, and the sting of humiliation still clung to his skin. He whispered something inaudible. And outside, one of the bikers who had escaped picked up his phone and began to make a call. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was their revenge. The sound of the diner door closing behind them was muffled by the night wind beginning to sweep across the highway. Night had finally overtaken the day, blanketing the sky in deep blue tones and long shadows. The fluorescent lights of the gas station cast halos over the cracked asphalt, and the flickering bulbs under the awning buzzed softly, as if they knew something serious had just happened. Jason paused for a moment beside the car. The veteran was already seated in the passenger seat, silently staring out at the road. His eyes seemed fixed on a distant point, but something inside them had changed. They no longer held the look of a man resigned to being forgotten. They held the gaze of someone who, though frail, had rediscovered his own dignity. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was immersed in an almost sacred tension. The customers remained silent, as if to break that moment would be sacrilege. The bikers stayed on the floor or sat slumped against the wall, defeated not just in body, but in spirit. None of them dared to look around. Not because they feared another attack, but because they now faced the one thing they'd never encountered before: shame. The waitress, once paralyzed, began clearing dishes and cleaning what had fallen during the confrontation. Her movements were slow, but there was a silent reverence in each gesture. She didn't look directly at the aggressors. She didn't need to. The silence judged them with more force than any word ever could. The gang leader remained on his knees. His face was sweaty, his eyes cast downward, his breathing heavy. Each attempt to stand was accompanied by an invisible weight dragging him back down, the weight of his own actions. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel feared. He felt exposed, weak, small. Jason was walking toward the car when something made him stop. A presence, a murmur, a shift in the air. He turned slightly and looked over his shoulder. Slowly, without rush, the gang leader had managed to get up. His fists were clenched and his eyes, though teary, still carried the same wounded arrogance that had brought him there. But now there was something else, something dangerous, something simmering beneath the surface. Jason observed him for a moment. He didn't respond with words. He simply stared. The veteran slowly turned his head, watching the scene from the corner of his eye. His expression hardened, as if sensing that this wasn't over yet. Inside the diner, one of the bikers grabbed his phone. Hesitant fingers typed quickly. A message sent. A call. A veiled threat for later. Jason turned fully and took a few steps toward the diner door, but he didn't go inside. He stopped on the threshold, at the edge between artificial light and the darkness outside. The gang leader, now surrounded by the few still standing, swallowed hard. One of them whispered something into his ear. And then, amid the sharp silence, he muttered a few short words, almost inaudible. He apologized. It wasn't a public confession. It wasn't brave. It was tense, awkward, dragged out. But it was real. The others began to follow, one by one, as if waking from a daze. The sound of apologies blended with the cautious footsteps of those wanting to leave as quickly as possible. None of them looked at Jason, nor at the veteran, only at the floor, where they had left their masks of superiority behind. Outside, Jason didn't smile. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Because the weight of that silence already said everything. The true punishment didn't come from the blows. It came from what was left after pride was stripped away in front of everyone. It came from exposure, from humiliation, from the judgment of eyes that used to look away and now stared back with contempt. The crowd began to slowly disperse. Some were still taking photos, recording videos, whispering like witnesses of something extraordinary. But what impressed the most wasn't the fight itself. It was the posture of the man who fought. Jason didn't seek glory. He didn't seek revenge. He had simply given a forgotten man the chance to be respected again. The veteran placed his hand on the car door handle, but didn't get in yet. He turned back, looking once more at the diner. His teary eyes weren't sad. They were filled with silent gratitude. He didn't need to say anything, because for the first time in years he had been seen. Jason walked around to the driver's side, opened the door, and got in. The engine started with a deep growl. The car rolled slowly out of the station, leaving behind a trail of dust and silence. But the night wasn't over yet. Inside the diner, the bikers began to regroup. Not for another fight, but for revenge. The leader, now more composed, spoke in a low voice, hatred simmering in his eyes. One of the bikers showed something on his phone. A location, a route, a plan. Outside, the sky was now completely black, and in the distance on the horizon, the sound of more engines approaching could be heard, muffled by distance but unmistakable. The veteran looked out the window as Jason drove. Neither of them spoke, but both knew this wasn't over. The road ahead was dark, silent, covered in shadows that moved like omens. In an alley just a few miles away, dozens of motorcycles began turning on their headlights. The sleeping road was about to wake up to something much bigger, and Jason already knew he'd have to face them again. But this time, it wouldn't be just for one old man. It would be for everyone the world pretends not to see. The road stretched ahead like a dark ribbon cutting through the night. The sound of the car's engine was steady, almost hypnotic. Inside, the silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence shared by those who don't need words to understand each other. A silence between marked men. Not by visible scars, but by stories never told. The veteran stared out the window. The landscape blurred past in dark smudges. Empty fields, abandoned barns, rusted signs worn by time. That scenery matched his life. Forgotten, faded, ignored. But now, something inside him had shifted. His breathing was steadier, his shoulders less slouched, as if something he believed lost had returned, even if just for a moment. The feeling of being seen, of being respected. Jason drove calmly. His eyes stayed focused on the road, but his mind wandered through old memories. Some he preferred to keep buried, and yet they came. Images of soldiers, dust, screams muffled by distant explosions. Of men who, like the one beside him, had fought for something bigger than themselves, and came home only to be forgotten. There was far more in common between them than met the eye. The car passed a small cluster of old trailers. A dog barked in the distance. A radio played a sad song, lost in the wind. Jason glanced over at the veteran. He held a small photo between his fingers, folded, frayed at the edges. The image was from another time. A young man in military uniform surrounded by smiling comrades in front of a helicopter. On the back, smudges of dirt and sweat. No words were spoken, but the pain was evident. That photo was all that remained from a time when he was seen as a hero. Now, he was just another forgotten name on a faded ID card, trying to remember why he still walked. Jason kept his hand steady on the wheel. He knew some ghosts don't need to be exorcised with words, only honored in silence. Across the road, headlights appeared between the trees. In the distance, the sound of engines multiplied. A muffled, growing noise. A vibration of threat, like thunder not yet arrived, but already announced. Jason noticed. He didn't look directly, but his body grew tense, more alert. They were coming. The road ahead widened into a fork. Jason took the left turn, guiding the car down a dimmer path, a cracked rural road cutting through an abandoned field. Dry trees lined the edge like silent sentinels. He parked near an old, crumbling barn. The place looked forgotten even by maps. But to Jason, it was perfect. Quiet, isolated, and most importantly, controllable. He got out of the car slowly. The night air was cold and the wind carried the scent of earth. The veteran stepped out as well, with difficulty, but he refused help. He wanted to stand on his own. He needed that. Jason walked to the barn's entrance. He pushed the rusted door, which gave way with a long creak. Inside, only shadows and silence. But in there, he could see everything. No blind spots. No surprises. The veteran sat on an old crate near the entrance, watching Jason closely. For the first time, he seemed to truly study the man who had defended him without knowing his name. And in him, he recognized something familiar, Not just strength, but pain. That same kind of emptiness that comes from outliving the ones you loved. Jason, with slow steps, moved to a broken window. Outside, the motorcycle headlights multiplied on the road, a glow growing like wildfire in dry grass. They were closing in, more than before, more organized, more dangerous. But Jason didn't move. His face didn't show fear, only resolve. The veteran stared at the sight with a mix of respect and concern. He knew what was coming, and he hated the feeling that once again he was the reason for the fight. The weight of guilt hung over him like a storm ready to break. Jason noticed. He turned slowly, locking eyes with the veteran, and then, for the first time that night, he made a rare gesture. He nodded slightly as if to say, "This isn't your fault." And that, more than any words, lifted something inside the man. The veteran took a deep breath. His eyes welled up again, but this time, there was honor in them. Outside, the sound of engines grew louder. The glow of headlights was now visible beyond the wooden fence. Tires spun, dust rose. The gang had returned, larger, more threatening, hungry for revenge. Jason took a few steps toward the barn's exit. The wood creaked beneath his boots. The night seemed to hold its breath once more. But he was ready. The first headlight lit up Jason's face. Behind it, 20 more flared on, blinding the road. They surrounded the place. And then, the engines shut off. A sinister silence settled in. Someone outside dismounted from their bike, and a cold voice sliced through the darkness. They weren't there to talk, they were there to finish what they started. The silence that fell over the open field was more threatening than the roar of motorcycles. There were no shouts, no bravado. Only the muffled sound of heavy boots on dry earth as the gang's shadows dismounted from their bikes and slowly spread across the terrain. From the center of the barn, Jason watched. He didn't hide. He didn't prepare to attack. He simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, hands at his sides. His face was serious, his gaze fixed. He didn't seem to fear the number of men surrounding him. He didn't even seem to factor it in. For him, there was only one mission: to finish what he started, and to protect what no one else would. The veteran, still sitting on the crate, remained silent. He didn't tremble, didn't cower, didn't cry. There was something firm in his expression, as if he finally understood what he represented in that moment. He wasn't just the reason for the confrontation. He was the symbol of what Jason was there to preserve, the dignity of the forgotten. The first bikers approached with wide strides, trying to project strength. They carried chains, batons, a few with brass knuckles gleaming under the moonlight. They were armed with youthful confidence and poorly digested rage. But something in their movements betrayed hesitation, because in front of them stood one man, and he didn't move. Jason took a step forward, just one step. It was enough. The tension burst like lightning across the sky. The first attacker charged with a muffled scream, swinging a chain above his head. Jason waited for the perfect moment, dodged with his body, and caught the chain in midair, swinging it back at the attacker. The strike wasn't brutal, but it was precise. The man dropped to his knees, undone by his own haste. Others came together, 2 from either side, trying to surround him. Jason pivoted on his heels, evading the first blow, and shoved the second into one of the barn's wooden pillars. The impact echoed loudly. A third tried to strike from behind, but Jason, in one fluid motion, used the man's force against him, spinning and throwing him to the ground with clean efficiency. There were no war cries, only the silent dance of a man who had faced far greater battles than those kids could ever imagine. Every blow thrown at him, Jason redirected with precision. Every attempt at domination was undone by his absurd calm, not driven by ego, but by necessity. And slowly, the gang began to understand. They weren't facing just a man. They were facing the weight of justice they had ignored all their lives. The gang leader, still hanging back among the last to move, watched with clenched fists. He saw his men fall one by one. He saw fear surface on previously smug faces. And finally, he felt the terror of being the last one standing. But he couldn't retreat. His pride wouldn't allow it. So he shouted, more to himself than to the others, and charged with brute force. Jason didn't hesitate. He met him head-on, unhurried. The leader threw a punch full of force but empty of technique. Jason ducked with a slight tilt of his head and struck the man's arm with an open palm, breaking the rhythm of the attack. A moment later, he spun and pushed him with his shoulder, sending him staggering backward until he dropped to his knees in the dirt. This time he didn't get up. Jason remained standing, breathing hard, but unharmed, surrounded by exhausted bodies, groaning men, and eyes that no longer dared to meet his. Dust rose from the ground. The night felt heavier. And then, the silence returned. A silence that spoke louder than any speech. The veteran rose with difficulty. He took 2 slow steps toward Jason. His eyes were shining. The man who had entered that diner, bent by life, now walked upright. Not because his body allowed it, but because his soul had been lifted by something greater than himself. He came close, stopped, and with a slight nod, he gave thanks. Jason responded with the same nod. Nothing more was needed. The gang members, broken and defeated, began crawling back to their bikes. Some murmured apologies, others simply lowered their heads. The arrogance had been stripped away, the hatred dissolved. All that remained was the weight of reality. They had chosen the wrong target. And now they knew it. Jason turned toward the car. The veteran followed. The road awaited. Before getting in, Jason looked one last time at the field behind him. And that's when he noticed. In the distance, a few lights flickered on. Local residents, discreet witnesses, people who had heard the noise and now saw the calm. They said nothing. But their gazes, this time, didn't avoid his. They saw, they respected, they understood. Jason got into the car. So did the veteran. The engine purred low. The dark road swallowed them like a curtain being drawn. Behind them, the dust still danced in the air. But in the hearts of everyone who had been there, something had changed forever. In a world where so many turn their faces away from injustice, Jason Statham has shown us that true strength lies in silence, and that a man's dignity should never be forgotten. If this story touched you, please like it now. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that honor still exists. In the comments, tell us where you're watching from and what you would do if you were in that diner. Until the next chapter of courage.